Today I'm gonna read this film language. The history of a country strongly impacts its position on the communicating scale. For an example, just think for a minute about the histories of two bookend countries on the scale, the United States and Japan. High context cultures tend to have a long shared history. Usually they are relationship-oriented societies where networks of connections are passed on from generation to generation, generating more shared context among community members. Japan is an island society with homogeneous populations and thousands of years of shared history, during a significant portions of which Japan was closed off from the rest of the world. Over these thousands of years, people came to particularly skilled at picking up each other's messages, reading the air, as Takaki said. By contrast, the United States, a country with a mere few hundred years of shared history, has been shaped by enormous influence of immigrants from various countries around the world, all with different histories, different languages, and different backgrounds, because they have little shared context. Americans learned quickly that if they wanted to pass a message, they had to make it as explicit and clear as possible, with little room for ambi- ambiguity, and misunderstanding. So within each language cluster, you may notice a pattern. See Figure 1.2. First, countries are clustered by language type. On the left, you see the Anglo-Saxon cluster, followed by the Romance language cluster, and finally, furthest to right is a cluster of the countries speaking Asian languages. Then within each cluster, you might notice how lengths of history and level of homogeneity impact the communication style. For example, within the Anglo-Saxon cluster, the United States has the most linguistic and cultural diversity and the shortest shared history. This helps to explain why the United States is the lowest context of the Anglo-Saxon cultures. In the Romance cluster, Brazil has the most diversity and is the lowest context culture. The same pattern holds with Asia, where the lower context countries like Singapore and India have the most linguistic and cultural diversity. The American anthropologist Edward Hall, who originally developed the concept of the low and high context communications while working on the Native American reservations in the 1930s, often used the analogy of marriage to describe the differences between high and low context communication. Imagine what happens when two people are married for 50 or 60 years. Having shared the same context for so long, they can gather enormous amounts of information just by looking at each other's faces and or gestures. Newlyweds, however, need to state their messages explicitly and repeat them frequently to ensure they are received accurately. The comparison to countries with longer or shorter shared histories is obvious. What makes a good communicator? In every life, we all communicate explicitly sometimes, while passing messages between the lines in other situations. But when you say someone is a good communicator, what exactly do you mean? The way you answer this question suggests where you fall on the scale. A Dutch executive in one of my classes noticed his country's low context positioning on the scale and protested. We speak between the line in the Netherlands too, but when asked whether a businessman who communicates between the lines frequently would be considered a good or bad communicator, he didn't have to think long. But there's the difference between us and the French, he said. In the Netherlands, if you don't say it straight, we don't think you are true worth it. If you are from low context culture, you may perceive a high context communicator as a secretive, lacking transparency, or unable to communicate effectively. Lou Edmondson, an American vice president for sales at Kraft, who travels around the world negotiating deals with suppliers in Asia and Eastern Europe, put in starkly, I have always believed that people say what they mean and mean what they say, and if they don't, well, then they are lying. On the other hand, if you are from the high context culture, you might perceive a low context communicator as appropriately stating the obvious. The obvious. You didn't have to say it, we all understood, or even as condescending and patronizing. You talk to us like we're children. Although I have lived and worked outside the United States for many years, low context communication is still my natural style. I'm embarrassed to admit that I have been subjected to both of these accusations more than once by my European colleagues. 4 years ago, a New York-based financial institution that I'd worked with previously asked me to do a cultural audit of their organization. Since corporate culture is not my specialty and I lacked the time necessary to do this project justice, I approached an Italian colleague whom I will call Paolo about the collaborating with me. Paolo greeted me cheerfully when we met in his office. 25 years my senior, Paolo has a well-earned reputation as an exceptional researcher and writer. He gave me a copy of his newest book and listened with interest as I described the collaboration's opportunity. I started by explaining that my work, family, and writing commitments provided very little time for these projects. Paolo nodded, and then the two of us explored the opportunity in more in-depth, discussing the client company and the specific issues that needed to be addressed. Still feeling a bit anxious about my time limitations, I repeated that Paulo would need to do 80% of the work and would, of course, receive 80% of the compensations. Then we returned to exploring the needs of the clients and possible approaches. But after a few more minutes, I once again slipped in my concern about time. Paolo laughed impatiently. Erin, I'm not a child. I was not born yesterday. I understand very well what your point is. I felt myself blushing with embarrassment. Paolo is quite used to reading subtitle messages. He had grasped my not so subtle points the first time. I apologized, wondering whether Paulo often reacted this way when speaking with the dozens of American faculty members at INSEAD who clarified and repeat themselves endlessly. The moral of the story is clear. You may be considered a top-flight communicator in your home culture, but what works at home may not work so well with people from other cultures. One interesting quirk is that in high-context cultures, the more educated and sophisticated you are, the greater your ability to both speak and listen with an understanding of implicit layered messages. By contrast, in low-context cultures, the most educated and sophisticated business people are those who communicated in a clear, explicit way. The result is that the chairman of the French or Japanese company is likely to be a lot more high context than those who work on the shop floor of the same company, while the chairman of the American or Australian organizations is likely to be more low context than those with entry-level jobs in the same organizations. In this respect, education tends to more move individuals towards a more extreme versions of the dominant cultural tendency. It's all relative. As we noted, when we considering the impact of the cultural differences on your dealing with other people, when matters is not so much the absolutely positioning of a person's culture on a particular scale, but rather their relative positionings in comparison to you. The examples that follow illustrate how this principle applies to the communicating skills. Both Americans and British fall towards the low context end of the communicating scale, but the British speak more between the lines than Americans do, a tendency particularly apparent with British high context humor. Many British people are fond of delivering the ironic and sarcastic jokes with a complete deadpan face. Unfortunately, this kind of humor is lost on many Americans. They may suspect the British people is joking, but they don't dare laugh, just in case he is not. As a result, the British often say that Americans don't understand irony. However, a more precise explanation is that Americans are simply more low context than the British. So, when Americans make a joke, especially in a professional setting, they are likely indicate clearly through explicit verbal or physical cues. This is a joke, something totally unnecessary when one British person is speaking to other. In their higher context culture, if you have to tell us it was a joke, then it wasn't worth it. The brief you used to tell it. Alastair Murray, a British manager living in Dubai, offers this for example. I was participating in a long-distance bike race across the UAE deserts with the hundreds of participants. In order to be collegial, I took a turn riding in front of another bike in order to break the headwind for him and help him save a little energy. A stranger had recently done the same for me. A little later the bike paddled up next to me and said it in a thick American accent. "Thanks very much for your help," I replied. "Oh sure, but I won't have done it if I'd known you were American." To someone British it would have been clear that this was a joke, and even a sort of gentle reaching out of friendliness. But as I delivered straight-faced with a serious voice, the Americans didn't seem to get it. He rode next to me in silence, beginning to pull slightly to the side. So then I thought about how often Americans say "just kidding" after joke. So I gave it a go. I told him, "Oh hey, just kidding." And he responded, "Oh, alright, haha, that was a good one. Where are you from?" Oh gosh, I thought, these literary Americans. The British may be more high context than Americans, particularly where humor is concerned, but in comparison with the Latin Europeans such as Spain and Italy, is including the French, they are very low context. I I once worked with the Stuart Shuttleworth, the CEO, owner, and the founder of a small British investment firm that had grown over 30 years from a one-man shop into a company with 100 employees. 2 years earlier, he had begun expanding the business internationally. Shuttleworth explained to me the cultural quandaries this expansion had created for him. Every day, as I see how my new counterparts work in Spain, France, and Italy, I'm asking myself if it is possible that what is obvious common sense to me may not be common sense in those environments. Take, for example, the simple process of the recapping a meeting. In the UK, it is the common sense that at the end of the meeting you should verbally recap what has been decided, which is most frequently followed by a written recap, including the individual's action items, with which we send out to all meeting participants. Clarifications, clarifications. In the UK, this is simply good business practice. I attended the meeting the other day in Paris with a group of my French-based employees and Parisian clients, one of our Parisian clients. As the meeting was clearly winding down, I awaited the final. "Here's what we've decided," recap of the meeting. Instead, one of the clients announced dramatically, "Et voilà," as if everything has been made clear. The others all stood up, patting one another on the back, and shaking hands, and stating words of appreciations and future collaborations. I couldn't help but wonder, but follow what? It seems that my French colleagues simply know what has been decided and who should do what without going through all of the levels of clarifications that we are used to in the UK. Shuttleworth was also confused by the email etiquette he encountered. In the UK, as in the US, if you send someone an email, then and that person doesn't have to the answer at the fingertips, but common sense and etiquette call for the receiver to respond within 24 hours saying something like, I got your message and will get back to you on Wednesday. In the other words, even if you have nothing to say, you should spell out explicitly in a low context way when you will have something to say. Lack of explicit communications signifies something negative. Now I send an email to our Spanish supplier, who I know does high quantity and on-time work and has a very good level of English, and I may not hear back from him or any of his colleagues for 3 or 4 days. I am biting my nails, assuming all sorts of the problems with my request that prevent a speed reply. Either that or the entire staff has fallen ill, or the building has burned down so that no one can read their emails. And then 3 years later, I receive an email telling me that they have done exactly as requested and everything is under control. Why couldn't they have said that in the first place? French, Spanish, and Italians are markedly more high context than Anglo-Saxon cultures. But the cultures of the Asia are more high context than any in Europe. As the center of the business world tilts towards China, understanding the communications patterns typical of China culture becomes increasingly critical. Elizabeth Shen is a consultant who splits her time between Shanghai and Paris, helping Europeans work effectively with the Chinese. This can be quite challenging, since as Shan observes, China is a huge country with the strong region differences. In many ways, it is difficult to categorize Chinese business culture, given its wide generations gaps and differences between private and public sectors. However, it's safe to say that Chinese culture in general is very high context in comparison with the cultures of the West. Shen explains. When Chinese vaguely express an idea or an opinion, the real message is often just implied. They expect their conversational partner to be highly involved and to take an active role in deciphering messages, as well as in mutual creating meaning. In Chinese culture, 旁敲巡礼, beating around the bush, is a style that nurtures an implicit understanding. In Chinese culture, children are taught not to just hear the implicit words, but also to focus on how something is said and on what is not said. I collaborated with the Shen to conduct interviews with the dozens of European managers from various business sectors who had spent significant portions of their careers in different regions of China. They had varying opinions on how to succeed on Chinese environment. In one of these interviews, Pablo Diaz, a Spanish executive who worked in China for a Chinese textile company for 15 years, remarked that in China, the message up front is not necessarily the real message. My Chinese colleagues would drop hints, and I wouldn't pick them up. Later, when thinking it over, I would realize I had missing something very important. Diaz recounts a discussion he had with a Chinese employee which went something like this. Mr. Diaz said, "It looks like some of us are going to have be here on Sunday to host the client visit." Mr. Chan said, "I see." And he replied, "Can you join us on Sunday?" "Yes, I think so. Then it would be great help." "Yes, Sunday is an important day." "In what way?" "It's my daughter's birthday." How nice. I hope you all enjoy. Thank you. I appreciate your understanding." Diaz laughs about the situation now. "I was quite certain he had said he was coming," Diaz said, "and Mr. Chan was quite certain he had communicated that he absolutely could not come because he was going to celebrating his daughter's birthday with his family." Diaz has learned from experience about how to avoid falling into these communication snafus. If I'm not 100% sure what I heard, shrugging my shoulders and leaving with the messages that I sort of think I heard is not a good strategy. If I'm not if I'm not sure, I have to take this responsibility to ask for clarifications. Sometimes I have to ask 3 or 4 times, and although that can be a little embarrassing for both me and my colleague, it is not as embarrassing as having a production line set and ready and waiting for Mr. Chen, who is contentedly singing happy birthday somewhere else. 오늘은 40쪽에서 50쪽까지 읽었고 30분에 이렇게 한 10쪽씩 읽는다고 가정을 하면 한 달 정도 있으면 7월 한 8월 초 정도면 이 책이 끝날 것 같아요. 근데 일단 이해하는 데 많이 도움이 되는 건 사실인 것 같습니다. 바이.